Spiritual death, spiritual rebirth. When I was starting to think about this talk, I thought that, in a sense, I feel with our system of practice, our system of meditation, I feel I've gone backwards in a strange sort of way. And I know this might sound a bit of a bold statement. I started with spiritual rebirth and went backwards. Or I'm going backwards. What do I mean by that? Well, when I first came along to the movement, which was in Brighton, to a front room in Brighton, the first ever class I was involved with was a full-length Padmavajra, followed by the sevenfold puja with concluding mantras, led by Buddhadasa. And I'm really very grateful that that was my first contact with the movement, because by the end of the puja, I knew exactly what I was going to do with my life. I was 17, but I knew that I'd devote my life to Buddhism. I didn't know what that meant. I even knew I was going to be an order member, and I'd only met an order member. I'd only met Buddhadasa for a few minutes with a handshake. But I knew definitively that this was my life. Chanting the mantras was like chanting words that I sort of already knew. I didn't know how I knew them, but this was it. And not long after that, I left home and I got fully involved in things. And I wanted very much in those days to have direct contact with enlightenment. Of course, you have to understand, and I know looking around there are some order members from those days who were in the order in those days. You have to understand that I was an adolescent, and this all these sort of experiences were all mixed up with all the confusion and immaturity of adolescence. I was probably insufferable in many ways. And very unintegrated and very immature. But nonetheless, looking back, there was no doubt what I wanted. In those days, when you became a mitra, you were taught the Shakyamuni practice and the stupa visualization practice. And very quickly, I developed a morning practice, which included that very, very fully, the Shakyamuni practice. I took up the prostration practice to Padmasambhava as early as I could before I was ordained, which was unusual in those days. Bhante said, when I said, won't it be a bit irregular if I did that? Because some order members were a little bit sort of sniffy about me taking it up. And he said, no, it's irregular, but it'll become regular. And the thing was, and I guess the thing is even now, I wanted to be in connection with enlightenment. I can't put it in any other way. I wanted to be in contact with images, symbols, beings who embodied that. I was enchanted by all that. I was fascinated by all that. It gave my life meaning, and indeed it still does. Without that connection, without that connection with the images of enlightenment, without that connection with particularly the image and the symbol that's most meaningful to me, life wouldn't be worth living. It's the very essence of life. All the other things that I'm involved with, the meetings with people, the emails, the discussion about how we run things, chopping onions and potatoes in the kitchen, whatever it may be, if I am not in connection with that dimension, it is all rubbish. It's all meaningless. The movement is meaningless to me. That is the golden thread that has to run through my life. It's not that I'm under no illusions. I don't feel anywhere near enlightenment or insight or stream entry or anything of that nature. Where I am in relation to it, it sort of doesn't matter. All that matters is connection. All that matters is the vibration, the resonance between me and what I long for. That's all that matters. And this really was sort of essentialised at my ordination, of course, that Bhante did on a weekend retreat in Thetford Forest, in Broomhouse Farm. And that event, that moment, particularly the private ordination, but the whole weekend, I refer to every day. Every day I refer to that. I meditate on that. I reflect on that. It's the centre of my life, even though it happened when I was a lad, when I was 19. That is actually the defining moment of my life. Everything sort of centres on it and leads from it. It was a very vivid and rich experience for me, and an unforgettable experience. I really felt and I was thinking about it, well, the private ordination probably is lucky if it lasted 20 minutes. I can't even remember the length of it, but it was brief. But I was thinking of a line I read in a Padmavajra text that went something like, in a moment you are bounded, in a moment you are liberated. It doesn't really sort of matter how much time these things take, but in that moment I suppose I glimpsed something eternal. I don't want to sound a bit over the top, but I mean that I guess is what it felt like. And that if Bhante had given me nothing else, just that would be enough. Just that, just giving the refuges and precepts, just intoning the mantra I took 3 times, slowly, deeply, would be enough. Just the word saying, this is you, at the end of the higher evolution. This is you as you really are, if you could only realise it. Just those precepts, that would be enough. That would be enough in itself. It was all in there. Very, very rich, and all sorts of experiences after that of, the mantra just going on like some great cosmic drone without my having to sort of recite it. But then the night after my public ordination, back in London, in my tiny little room in the legendary number 5 Balmore Street community, my little room that was covered with reproductions of tankas, I had a sort of prophetic waking dream. And in this waking dream, from a beautiful reproduction of a tanka of Padmasambhava seated on the copper-coloured mountain, there came what I can only describe as a sort of thunderbolt of energy that was absolutely terrifying. Absolutely terrifying, going straight to the heart, straight to the sort of vitals of my consciousness, of my being. Well, I felt it on a sort of cellular level, I think, like an incredible electric current going straight to me, and it was absolutely terrifying, and so much so that I forced myself out of whatever state I was in, and Visantra, who was sharing the room with me, I just woke him up, just sort of muttering, "It's the picture, it's the picture," which, was terribly disturbing to Visantra. He didn't get to sleep after that. I did, but... and of course, at the time, I thought, brilliant, I've had a weird dream, fantastic. But actually, what it was, I think it was sort of prophetic. I thought it was, looking back, I think it was actually telling me what it was going to be like, what my spiritual life was going to be like from now on. And I think the way I could sum that up is that longing for vision, for beauty, that attraction to the enchanting, beautiful, meaningful nature of enlightenment has drawn me on, but has always led me into death. Always. And, I could, when I look back over my order life, that is what has happened. Moments of boldness and inspiration and moving forward and so on, followed by, really awful humiliation and shame at seeing the sort of meanness of my nature, or just the fear of getting into situations that are utterly bewildering and confusing and that I don't understand and that are really frightening, including situations where I'm confronted with physical death itself. First going to India was an overwhelmingly frightening experience for me. I'd gone there inspired by the vision of the Dharma, of spreading the Dharma there with Lokamitra, only to find myself becoming absolutely sort of terrified, traumatized by being in a different culture, by seeing on the streets old age, disease and death, and not knowing what to do in relation to that. Love is a man-eater. It eats up human nature and leaves nothing behind. Once it devours this nature, it gains possession of the domain of the lover's being and becomes its commander. This is from a Sufi text, surprise, surprise. But, I respond to that because I think it describes actually what has happened. There have been times of, wanting to pull back, but not being able to pull back when there's nothing seemingly, that's helping you to go forward, that there's nothing there which is of any, it's all painful, it's all destructive, it's all bewildering, and yet you can't turn back. I know I'm not alone with this experience in the movement. And it is what we are being asked for with spiritual death, spiritual rebirth. And I think we have to keep this in mind, is total death, total obliteration, spiritual death. I mean, death, literal death means that. There's nothing left. Well, spiritual death means that. It's everything. I think in the original lecture, Bhante says it's even the positive sense of self that we've built up through integration and positive emotion. It all has to go. Oh, but what if there were nothing to understand, nothing to learn? What if we had simply to accept incomprehension, accept defeat, accept collapse, disintegration, death, face dissolution of the mind, abdication of reason, erasure of what can be weighed, numbered, measured, sensed, known, face descent into hell without hope of resurrection on the third day. Are we prepared for this? Asks Bhante on Glastonbury Tour. So, yes, talking like this brings up the whole topic of fear. I experience... wasn't meant as a joke. I experience a lot of fear, I guess a lot of the time on different levels. Sort of terror, often in solitary retreat, in the dark, sometimes in the middle of the night when I wake up. Terror of death, actual physical death, or anxiety sometimes, quite a lot of the time, when there's a difficult situation to encounter, maybe in the community, the ordination process, the preceptors' college, the movement, etc., etc. And I've had to think a lot about fear. And I fear death, I fear physical death, and so I have to regularly contemplate the fact of death. I like the classic Tibetan meditations on death, where they talk about the three great truths that you need to meditate on. The actual fact of death, that you will die as everybody else will die. And secondly, that the fact of death, death can come at any time, at any moment. And actually at the time of death, the only thing that you can, that is going to help you in that moment is the Dharma, or we might call it the creative mind. I regularly meditate on that. But it's a pretty obvious point. I think my fear of physical death is exactly the same as my fear of spiritual death. It's the same fear. It's the same thing. It's fear of change, fear of the unknown, fear of what I love being taken away from me, or what I know being taken away from me, fear of being put into contact with what I don't want, or just what's other. Fear dominates me, and I would say it's probably the strongest sort of poison in my consciousness. And of course, it's bound up with craving and aversion and ignorance and conceit and all the rest of it. But fear seems to be very strong. I've come to the conclusion that, for example, with metta, with loving kindness, it's not really kind of hatred and aversion that is the issue. It's fear. It's fear that is the enemy of my developing boundless loving kindness. It's always fear that seems to be at the forefront. When I notice myself, oh, I'm not going to talk to that person. I'm not going to engage with that person, or I don't like what they're saying. When I look at it, actually there's a fear of going into a communication where my ideas and my values and my understanding of things will change. It really is as simple and as graphic as that. And of course, this is the wonderful thing about Sangha, about spiritual community, about being part of a growing and expanding spiritual community, because there is a constant and continuous demand to die spiritually. So many times I'm confronted with new worlds, with other consciousnesses. So many times I'm presented with somebody that I've never met anybody like them before. And this is the wonderful thing about the ordination process, about having the big men's events here, of visiting centres and so on. So many times I have to, leave behind and move beyond the limited range that I know that's familiar, and, to open up to something different. And there is a kind of vulnerability in that. There is a fear in that. I have to be courageous, to go forward to do that. Or conflicts. I find conflicts so difficult. Or hearing about conflicts. Like probably many of you, I hear about conflicts. People tell me about the conflicts in their centre that they're a part of. And, there's part of me that just wants to fix it. Just find a way of fixing this, because I'm frightened of, rather than entering into and understanding, what is happening here? What's going on? I think also another fear that I have to overcome, another way of sort of expanding, of spiritually dying, of being reborn, is to recognise the different manifestations of spiritual potential. There are manifestations of that I like. There are manifestations of that, I don't even see them as manifestations of that. The person just looks weird, boring, or whatever. And in order to really see that the different manifestations of the spiritual potential in others, there has to be, a letting go of what I know. Nick Keats's negative capability comes up here. This capability to suspend, to negate oneself, and to identify with another, and to be willing to be in mysteries and doubts when you do that. So I think you can see from this, I said I felt that I've worked backwards, that, in order to really spiritually die and to really be spiritually reborn, I've had to practice Metta Bhavana, and I also have to practice Metta Bhavana, and I have to practice concentration and attention and integration and mindfulness. I've just got a few more minutes left, so I just want to say a couple of other things. I want to say something about commitment. Recently I was asked, how can we practice spiritual death and spiritual rebirth on a daily basis, on a moment-by-moment basis? And, we've had quite a lot of input this weekend on how we might do that. But I found myself saying that I think, actually, if we're going to take spiritual death and spiritual rebirth seriously, we mustn't think of these things as slogans or techniques. It's great that we want to have the system of practice more pervasive throughout the movement. But I'd really hate it if suddenly we start hearing people, oh, I'm having a spiritual death, or I'm having a spiritual rebirth. And when you look at it, you don't actually see any real change and transformation. It's like Bhante's commentary on Trungpa's commentary on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, where Trungpa Rinpoche says that, well, you experience bardo all the time. And Bhante said, well, in a way that flatters the disciples, that flatters the audience. Do people really experience it all the time, actually? You only experience bardo when something is taken away, when there is a death. That's when you enter that creative, groundless space. And I think that's actually only possible when you make a commitment to the spiritual life. So if we're going to talk about these stages of practice, we must also start introducing to people the notion of commitment and vowing to follow the Dharma. It's very striking, all of the talks this weekend, and it was very vivid with Bodhinaga because he's so in touch with it. You notice that these things become real because there is a commitment. There's a stepping forth into death and rebirth. Alone, going it alone, a standing out, and there's a taking of responsibility for spiritual life, and there's a real exposure with that. There's an entry into a community, there's an entry into a spiritual community, and a standing out, a standing alone. So I think it's so important that we reflect on this and that we remember this. It's not to do with just with meditation practices. It is to do with daily life. It's to do with the act of spiritual commitment. So we really need, I think, to reflect on that probably more and more. And I'm so struck hearing and, reading in Shabda, hearing order members talk about their different crises, their spiritual deaths, order members of long standing who've really served the movement and the order and have really stepped out and exposed, been very exposed. And how they kind of crumble and how difficult it is when they're faced with new experience. That happens because of their commitment. And of course they carry on because of their commitment, because of their vow to practice the Dharma for the benefit of all beings. So I think it's very important to remember that. I was very struck a year or two ago listening to a program called World Roots, a very good Radio 3 music program. And it was about an Afghan Qawwali group. Very good Qawwali group, actually. Very lovely songs. And they were asking them and they lived in the music quarter of Kabul. And they were being asked what it was like under the Taliban. And the leader of the Qawwali group, he said, well, in our Sufi tradition, we say, when the roof is taken off the house, the sky and the sun comes in. So in other words, when you're broken, when you're taken apart, that's when the truth shines even more strongly. And he was sort of chuckling, and then he said, the harder they beat us, the louder we sang. So I think that, I found that I think this is related to this business of commitment, of standing and singing more loudly the joys of spiritual rebirth when everything is taken away, because you've got that vision of him, you've got that vision of the Dharma vividly, beautifully before you. And I think that's another thing I'd like to mention and to close on, is the importance of joy and celebration. It's true, spiritual death, spiritual rebirth, we use this sort of language, it's strong stuff. But one of the things that's very striking when you read, of the great masters of spiritual death and spiritual rebirth, very conscious of Padmasambhava with his skull cup of spiritual death and that Amrit nectar of eternal great bliss that he carries. I'm very conscious of that image there. There's the bliss, the constant bliss. And of course, the Dharmachari's life is I love this, in Dharmachari, constantly coursing, constantly moving on. Bante's quoted the perfection of wisdom. We stand in a manner of no standing. We course in a manner of no coursing. Constant spiritual death, constant spiritual renewal. Well, it's also learning, I think, the joy of that, the spontaneous joy, the spontaneous activity, and sharing that joyfully with others. So I'm going to end with some Dharma words that expresses this. It's the last of the ox herding pictures. Entering the marketplace with bliss-bestowing hands. Bare-chested and barefooted he enters the market, face streaked with dust and head covered with ashes, but a mighty laugh spreads from cheek to cheek. Without troubling himself to work miracles, suddenly dead trees break into bloom. In friendly fashion this fellow comes from a foreign race, with features like those of a horse or again like a donkey. But on shaking his iron staff, all of a sudden all gates and doors spring wide open for him. From out of his sleeve the iron rod flies right into the face, with a great laugh spread all over his face. He talks Mongolian or speaks Chinese. He speaks in any language to anybody. Wide open the palace gates to the one who on meeting himself yet remains unknown.